we've got a whole set of questions and we've got a whole load of them tying for top place. So I will have to randomly allocate them. So what we're going to do, if I read them out, and I'll read out the person to whom on whom they're focused. If you could possibly just pop your video back on whilst you answer the question. We've got several for Clayton, we've got a couple for Philip, and we've got some others I know that probably should be merged because they look like duplicates. Anyway, so a quick one, hopefully, that will be fairly rapid to answer for Clayton is, are the rating events related? Are they on a fixed time schedule, or are they random, or a mixture, or essentially how did you prompt people to respond, I think is the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now with the Fitbit platform, we have the ability to kind of set the prompts, the vibration to happen up to, I think, 5 or 6 times per day. And it's kind of spaced out amongst a certain time schedule. So that's not the most optimal way. Obviously, if we could improve the app, we could start asking questions in a more targeted way. It's a little bit difficult with the Fitbit platform because there isn't quite as much of a real-time link between a Fitbit and a smartphone. But that's a feature that we're kind of working on. We would love it if people would contribute if they would like to do that. But right now it just prompts based on a setting of like 5 times a day, 3 times a day, 2 times a day, something like that. But the participants also can leave ad hoc feedback. So the watch face is always on, and you can push a button if you want to leave ad hoc feedback. So that's a great question.
Great, thank you. And Clayton, just whilst you're there, I've got another one at the top of the list, which is rather more open-ended, which is, in your opinion, how many parameters are needed to provide an acceptable understanding of needed comfort? Should we collect data for or for other purposes' sake as well?
That's a great question. I'm a little scared of that question this time. I don't think of an answer for that. I mean, that's a great question. In a lab setting, you're trying very, very hard to reduce the number of data that could influence the thing that you're trying to test. And in the field, we can't control the environments at all, pretty much. And we're not really telling the participants, we're not giving them any guidelines. We're saying kind of live your life and go to the places you usually go. And we're sort of tracking you. Here's the consent form that lets us track you. And so we're trying to collect as much data as we possibly can because the types of models that we're training, there's a whole process in the machine learning process where we're finding the signals in some of these data sources that we basically just added to the methodology to say, okay, let's just add that data source to the methodology, see if there's a signal in there that's actually helping to predict what people's preferences are. So this is a little bit different than, like I said, in a lab setting. So we as researchers can do that. If you were to try to deploy this solution in practice, obviously you couldn't just deploy sensors for the sake of having sensors. So we're trying to use the models to determine what are the most valuable data feeds and what is kind of generalizable. If you repeat this methodology 20 times in 20 different places, are those the same signals from place to place? So there's a lot of work to be done, but that's a great question. I'm not sure if I kind of avoided the question a bit.
No, that's good. Thank you. I think the point actually about ethics approval and what you're collecting data for is quite important, because if you're non-specific, you will get raised eyebrows, of course. Yep. And then it's not clear that you can do other things with that data down the line if you didn't get informed consent for that. So it's a very important point. Thank you. Thank you, Clayton. There's one or two others, but I'll come back to you perhaps if I can. We've got a highly uprated comment, actually, not a question, it's a comment for June, which I'll just read out. It's from Zoltan, which is, congratulations on your faculty position. And I understand your PhD defense is via Zoom in June, and an invite is going to the community. Does that mean everybody can join in? It's public? No pressure.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, that's my advisor's plan, though.
Excellent. Well done. Well done.
Thank you.
Okay, so if I could switch, Philip, there's a question for you from Clarice. How do personas fit within the mindset of speculative buildings? In other words, how do you reconcile the needs and aspirations from your personas with the ones of your clients if they are not the building user, in particular when they're conflicting? Philip, perhaps if you could address that one.
So that's a great question. And just thinking about it for a few minutes now, speculative building is really a development process. Whereas I think personas are fundamentally a design tool or methodology. And I'm not ignoring the fact that the development process and the design process have to work together. But generally right now, what we see is we're making most of our design decisions based off first cost or chasing an energy target, where in our particular study, we're working in affordable or social housing. So we have data about the users, and we really split that persona between a senior and non-senior user based off of the type of housing development was planned. I do agree that it will be challenging if we are just generally speculatively building housing out there. But again, back to to look at lessons learned from HCI. Are these technology companies, they're in a sense speculatively developing these technologies, right? So what lessons can we learn from HCI and the way that they design for users that they may not know?
Okay, thank you, Philip. There's one more, if I could just keep you.
If I could ask a quick follow-up.
Sorry, yes, go ahead, Michael.
For Philip. Do your kind of classifications and personas include like mental models about how the occupants believe the systems are working? We see that a lot with thermostats, that people think that thermostats act like a valve and you can turn them up and it'll act faster. Are you kind of incorporating that into your personas?
Great. So thanks for the question. Not now, but one of the methods that we're really interested in in these kind of in these specific human technology interactions are a think aloud protocol, where we give the user a task, and then as they're doing it, just say, hey, tell me everything that all of your self-talk that's occurring while you're interacting with this. Oh, I pushed this. I really would have expected to see this icon here, this button. But it's not here, so the think aloud protocol, we think we can unpack some of those interactions and also start to build some mental models for to kind of get broader acceptance, better usability of these technologies.
Great, thanks. The follow-up question was, how many personas have you generated, Philip, in your work?
Yeah, great question. So for this study, we did 2, and that was really driven by, and I mentioned earlier in the study, it can be flexible based off the data that you have. In Virginia, the sample that we're using, the developments are split between senior developments and non-senior developments. So we have special kind of senior housing, and so we also saw in the analysis that seniors use more energy per square foot. And they also have very different preferences for indoor environmental quality and appliance interactions. So the data analysis really drove the way that we split the personas. And we know that a non-family persona, anybody from 18 years old to 64 could be a wide range, but we use the occurrences in the data to drive kind of the outcomes of the analysis.
Great, thanks again for that. So I've got a question, we've got one bubbling up here for June. In the experiment setting, does every occupant get one hardware device, or would there be one device per thermal zone or room? And how could conflicting votes be addressed?
Yeah, so first of all, we deployed the system like back in February and still collecting data without people's vote, and like because of shut off in our campus. Anyway, the answer to that is our target is more like the closed office, the individual office unit. So we use like 10 offices as a control experimental group. So they have a device, but nothing happened. And another 10 is experimental group. And they all 20 are like a closed office unit. And we installed 2 other devices for open plan office. So, but that is more like a complementary study to see how the confliction about the voting going on. But the easy answer here is our main target is more for individual closed office unit.
That's great, thank you very much. So we've got a couple here for Clayton, and I know you've been waiting for the top one on the list, haven't you? I'm going to ask you the second one first because it might be quicker. Estimate of the willingness of people to provide ratings.
Yeah, so the test participants that we have had so far were paid like experimental test participants that we recruited and things like that. So we haven't gone about testing the ability, of in practice, maybe how this would work, but we have talked to a few design firms and a few companies that are thinking about using this methodology. And the thing that keeps bubbling up is like how, you know, if you give people, when a building is first opened, you give everyone a watch that they wear for a month or 2 weeks or something. And over that time period, you're able to characterize the spaces, but also characterize kind of what we call the comfort personalities of the people. And that could be something that could be repeated, you know, at certain intervals or something. And then each of the people who participate maybe get a rebate or a gift card or something. So I mean, we have found that it is very easy for people to use the watch, that it is what we consider it to be non-intrusive. We had very high compliance rates. We didn't have pretty much anybody who dropped out. But we did have to sort of like put checks in there to make sure people weren't just sitting there leaving feedback every 2 minutes, you know, and we had to figure out ways to filter out disingenuous data and stuff like that. So it's still a work in progress. We'd happy if other people would start to look at using this and we could share ideas.
Great, thank you. And then the one at the top. Do you have long-term goals for updating comfort models?
That's a great question. And I think I just answered a few of the non-accurate responses.
Yeah, you did, yeah.
But for Sarah's question, so one of the big things that came out of this that we think is interesting is that when people can leave feedback in a longitudinally intensive way, so if you can get, you know, hundreds of feedback points from a single person, you can start to characterize their what we call their personality in a sense. Like, do they consistently really fit nicely into your traditional PMV model framework? You know, does temperature humidity really work well for one person, but another person's a little less easy to predict in that sense? So in the paper, we have a preprint, which I can send to anyone. It kind of goes through that, and we think it's clustering people according to their preferences using longitudinally intensive data is something that we're targeting. And Matthias Quintana, one of my PhD students, is working heavily on that now. So if you have questions, I can always refer to him.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, Gadir, we have a question for you. How did you define the thresholds, especially for visual comfort, since there's no generalized recommendations in the literature for each metric, such as vertical eye illuminance in your proposed shading control?
Yeah, really, it was a study for Karslin in 2016, and he was doing evaluation of solar shading control strategies regarding the vertical illuminance at the eye level. So it was above 1,700 lux. So I just use his recommendation about this threshold value for the vertical illuminance, because above that we had the glare problem. So yeah, I think he was maybe the only one, or there was he also depends on other previous studies, and he confirmed that through his experiment also.
Great, thank you for that. So there's a question for Brody. Actually, so there was one at the top of the list. They just swapped, so I'm going to ask them both, actually, Brody, if you're there. The first was about the CO2 sensor uncertainty and whether the difference that you detected was within the uncertainty bounds. That's more of a technical question. If you could perhaps address that one first, and then we'll go to the top one.
Sure. So for the CO2, if you're talking purely in terms of like a student t-test, then yes, there is a statistical significance between the two data sets, but then it should, I should point out that so the 33 ppm change that we observed, the mean sensor bias is about 38 ppm. So there, you know, there's a little bit of interpretation to that as if it's actually changed or if the sensors are beginning to drift or things like that. So yeah, maybe that is worth noting when we're looking at the changes.
Cool. Okay, good, thanks. And then the top one. With respect to the vacancies, it's kind of almost a question I asked, but sort of placed really up to date for you.
Sure, yeah, exactly. So that's actually interesting. So the way that the building is this, our program is actually still implemented in the building, and I've just checked on it the other day actually and looked. And because the building has been empty, because we have our controls in place, it's in the lowest occupancy mode, and it's been operating that way, which is good. But I have a sneaking suspicion that most buildings are still running with their air handlers on the same schedule that they've been running on across the board, more or less. So there definitely is plans. We have a data set in Ottawa that is very robust, that has a lot of sensors that we definitely, I think as I transition out of my master's into my PhD, the first order of business for us will be to look at that data and see if buildings have made any adaptations, what buildings haven't, and you know, what the energy implications are of that.
Great. Okay, thank you. Cool. Just take that one off. So, so we're sort of getting towards the end of the session and the questions. So another one for Clayton, which is about, I think, partly also related to the question that was asked of Brody about the accuracy of measurements with wearable devices, and whether there's any drawbacks to that that can be easily overcome.
Yeah, that's a great question. Sensor accuracy, once again, that's another big challenge in field studies. We have hundreds of IEQ sensors, fixed sensors deployed. We had a bunch of, wrist-mounted temperature sensors. The heart rate sensor of Fitbits seems to be okay, more or less. There's a few things in the literature that show that maybe sometimes it's not so good. But we taking all those things into consideration in a field study is really part of the process. And that's something that, you know, when you have field studies and you're trying to make generalizations, it's really, sometimes it's the amount of data. If you have enough data from enough people spread across enough locations, the volume of data allows inferences to be made despite noise. And this is really this is what, you know, Google and Amazon and all these companies have kind of figured out over the last few decades. You really, when you don't have the ability to control things quite as well as in a lab, you just basically need a lot more data in a sense. At least that's our hypothesis that we're working on. So it's hard to get things perfect in the field. It really is. So we're just trying to figure out ways to address that.
Cool, thank you. Further work, of course, as always. So a question for June. What sort of occupant behavior types are you using to help generalize the agent's performance?
Yeah, so we use the previous literature from Mohamed Ouf and Brakane, and it's a logistical curve, and you change the numbers on that curve. So you can select either a very picky person about their thermal environment or a very generous person about their push button change or thermostat change. So that's the kind of, to change the numbers of logistical curve, then we're trying to generalize the performance of OCC.
Great, thank you. And I think probably the last question for this session is to Gadir. Adjusting the shading has an immediate effect on light, but an effect on temperature that is at least partly delayed. Is that driving your findings?
Yes, exactly. This is what I get from the results. So there was like slight differences in between the fourth session. And the fourth session was executed for 1 day, 7 hours, and each session was 1.5 hours. So during transferring from one session to another, there was like very slight differences in the operating temperature during the day. So yeah, this is was approved in the results.
Great, thank you for answering that one. And thank you everybody for your contributions to the session. Well done all the speakers and also everybody who contributed through the questions and kept to time. The next session will be starting sometime after 14:35, which is when this one officially formally ends. If I could ask the chair and presenters who may be in this session now to join the next session as soon as you can, so you can get set up and ready to go by 10 to 3 UK time at least. So thanks again everybody for your questions and for answering them as well. I believe all the questions will be saved and hopefully shared. So those that weren't asked of individuals can be very useful feedback to you. And I hope that the discussions continue on. Thank you very much again.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.